Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. I think we've given adequate time for everyone to get into the room and get acclimated to the Zoom meeting climate. All right, good evening. Before we begin our presentation, we have a brief aerial video tour of Rockland's main business activity districts that we'd like to show you. The purpose of the video, it's intended to help us consider where certain ideas that we might generate could work in certain parts of town. So, Christian, next slide, please. It's not working? Hold on, let me see. Not working. All right, we're having technical issues with the video, so we have it available in the part 2. So let's go on to with the rest of the presentation. Christian, next slide, please. So thank you for joining us this evening. The online open house workshop about to commence. The public online community forum is being recorded and will be shared online for the benefit of those who are unable to participate. Thank you for joining us during this challenging time. This workshop is aimed at gathering collective ideas and having possible next steps in place for when a sense of normalcy returns. Next slide, please. Welcome to the third public forum for the Rockland Master Plan process. Our forum tonight will address 4 of the master plan's planning topics. Last year, the town decided to embark on a master planning process for the Rockland community. Master planning can offer a roadmap or a guiding reference document that can be used to inform future collective decision-making. The process has included a 9-member Master Plan Advisory Committee, the MAPC consultants team, and participating community members. This third Master Plan workshop comes in 2 parts. This real-time Zoom meeting event for those of you currently logged on, as well as a part 2 online open house room that will be live throughout the entire month of June for additional community participation opportunities at the convenience of community members, day or night, weekday or weekend. Next slide, please. The town is contracted with the MAPC Regional Planning Agency as the consultants to lead the process to obtain community input. I am Carlos Montanez, the project manager for the Rockland Master Plan. Joining us tonight are the town administrator, Doug Lapp, and assistant town administrator, Jen Constable. We also have various master plan committee members participating, representing a variety of community stakeholder interests, as can be seen from their affiliations on the slide. These include the Open Space and School Committees, the Reimagine Rockland nonprofit community organization, the Regional Chamber of Commerce, residents, a member of the Select Board, and the Capital Planning and Zoning Appeals Boards. Helping us with the workshop content and meeting logistics tonight are Ralph Wilmer, Nicole Sanchez, Courtney Lewis, and Christian Brandt, as well as assistance from Mark Rassicott. Next slide, please. As the regional planning agency for Greater Boston, MAPC strives to help communities supplement their local capacity, brainstorm ideas, and find common solutions to issues that cross municipal boundaries. Next slide, please. Rockland is part of MAPC's South Shore Coalition subregion. This coalition meets regularly to address common issues and attempts to pull together collective ideas. Next slide, please. This oblique aerial view highlights downtown Rockland in the central red area, surrounded by the orange area, which represents the compact residential areas within walking proximity. One can also see the concentration of major commercial and industrial businesses in purple in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Lastly, to the center left is the Abington MBTA commuter rail station within close proximity to central Rockland. Next slide, please. Here is a brief high-level overview of Rockland for context. Half of the land area is some form of open space. A quarter of the land area is used for residential and commercial industrial uses. While Rockland's population is projected to remain stable through 2030, there are noteworthy differences between median family and non-family household incomes. Lastly, in addition to smaller Main Street businesses, Rockland has a notable employment center. Altogether, there are 570 businesses and over 7,000 workers. Next slide, please. Transportation-wise, mobility options beyond personal cars include indirect mass transit service via 3 nearby commuter rail stations, existing limited regional bus service, which could hold potential for supporting seniors, youth, and employees, and recent improvements to the rail trail for biking and walking connections. Next slide, please. Your input is necessary and important in strengthening master plan ideas. It can inform the plan recommendations, provide a general idea of how to influence the future of the community, as well as shape specific parts of town. It's intended to inform future decisions at local boards, committee meetings, and even at town meeting. Master plan recommendations are not final decisions and only provide a snapshot of community input at the time of the planning process. Next slide, please. So far, the master planning process has entailed advisory committee meetings, various community outreach efforts to community organizations and residents, an online survey, and 2 community workshops. Next slide, please. Tonight's online open house meeting is in 2 parts. Part 1 is tonight's online Zoom meeting, Thursday, May 21st. Keeping in mind where certain ideas could go spatially within in town, we will now go over some informational background slides as well as the 4 workshop topic slides. Before we break out into smaller discussion groups, we will have a poll to get everyone's feedback on all of the topics. The second part of the open house is for you and for those who weren't able to attend tonight's online meeting in order to provide additional feedback at your own pace throughout the entirety of the month of June. Please share the link that you see on your screen, mapc.ma/rmp_3rd. Share it with far and wide to ensure the most possible community input into master plan ideas. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This master planning effort builds on recent community efforts as well as successes. The town has been proactively addressing community challenges and opportunities. We hope to build upon the community's assets, such as its active artist community, its unique businesses, and local pride. Next slide, please. Some of the findings from recent planning studies are that they touch on the need to upgrade facilities and infrastructure to support existing residents and businesses. Housing issues from these recent studies touch on affordability, accommodating an aging population, and local control over potential housing proposals. Next slide, please. Overall, a lot of these different issues and ideas are interconnected. Decisions on one idea can be intertwined to other goals or challenges. Some of the goals stated from prior studies are related to downtown revitalization for a vibrant, walkable retail shopping district. Also, housing affordability and supply, and options for getting around town for youth, seniors, workers, and shoppers. Key challenges that can overlap with these goals are water and wastewater capacity to support desired revitalization, as well as streetscape improvements for the enjoyment of residents, as well as to support attracting customers to shops. Next slide, please. A 5-month-long master plan survey had 341 participants answer at least one question, with between 200 to 300 responses on most questions. Next slide, please. Survey responses provided insight into both concerns as well as opportunities. Some of these included housing affordability, improving and preserving parks, increasing the number of seasonal community events, and upgrading public facilities to be energy efficient green buildings. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go into the workshop content. So for the first topic, our first workshop topic tonight is housing. As we think about Rockland's residential neighborhoods, we could consider what types of choices and options exist for others, as well as oneself down the road. Next slide, please. This is a quick icebreaker poll. Can you guess what are last year's median sales prices for a single family home and a condo in Rockland? Now, you should be getting a pop-up screen. Please take a few seconds to vote. Has everyone fully voted? Should we? All right. So as you can see on your screen, oh, interesting. So the correct answer is 355,000 for the single family and 280,000 for the condo. It's interesting to see, the disparity there. So next slide, please, Christian. So as seen by our icebreaker poll, there's a $75,000 difference between a condo and a single family home in 2019. The lower condo price can present a reduced barrier to home ownership for younger adults, as well as an option to those looking to downsize. This dovetails with a growing segment of the population that is aging. Beyond home ownership matters, housing affordability should also be considered. 2 out of 5 households spend more than 30% of their income on housing, and a third of the households are non-family households, which have a lower median household income. Lastly, while the town does have a variety of housing stock, it is still below the state's minimum 10% for the subsidized housing inventory. Showing steady progress by permitting 35 to 37 units annually can afford the town local control over Chapter 40B proposals. Next slide, please. The town has an approved housing production plan through the year 2021. The housing production plan explored potential locations for the proactive siting of housing. We welcome your input on these and/or other potential areas later in the program. Next slide, please. As we consider housing needs and options, we want to explore a variety of housing types. Here are a few examples we can discuss later in the program. Next slide, please. Here is another way of looking at housing typologies and options for a community, as shown in this diagram from the Opticos Design Incorporated consultancy. It shows housing types as a scale transition between single families and mid-rise multifamily. They refer to it as missing middle housing. It illustrates that the many forms and options that are needed to address the housing needs, housing preferences, affordability, as well as housing supply concerns. Next slide, please. Another way of looking at the housing element of the master plan is to consider how it overlaps with other planning topics and goals. The town's 2019 Downtown Strategy Report shows how opportunity sites in Rockland can be planned to serve as multi-purpose, transformative redevelopments that also address historic preservation and the upgrading of public facilities. Next slide, please. Here is another example of how housing is also connected to other town goals, such as downtown revitalization. A future potential mixed-use downtown with ground floor restaurants supported by upper story residential all depend on having the infrastructure and capacity to support both of these types of uses. Now, this is a segment of the program. Before we move on to the other three workshop topics, we're going to do, much like we did before, a poll to get your feedback and input on some questions we have about some of these housing issues that we discussed a few minutes ago in the informational slides. So, Christian, deploy the. There are three questions. So you'll see question one, which says, what types of housing options do you prefer for yourself? Take a minute to answer that one and then scroll down for the other two questions, please. Okay, I'm seeing some voting activity. We'll give perhaps another minute or so for everyone else to have an opportunity to answer all three of the housing poll questions. Okay, I think we're about to close the poll. So let's see here for the first housing poll question. What types of housing options do you prefer for yourself? Overwhelmingly, single family homes on larger lots. Got the most on that one. Moving to question 2, do you ever see yourself needing or desiring any of these housing options in the future? Select all that apply. And not anything conclusive there. There's a little bit of interest on several of those. On the third question, what challenges do you see regarding housing affordability? Lack of affordable market rate homes for sale, as well as lack of options for seniors, were the ones that had the most interest. All right, thank you for doing that. And now we'll move on to the other 3 workshop topics. And similarly for each one, we'll have a poll before we do the breakout groups.
Good evening, this is Ralph Wilmer. I'll be talking about open space. We need to go back a few slides. So we'll be talking a little bit about passive and active recreation, as well as providing recreation for all residents of the town of Rockland. Some of you may be aware of the fact that we recently worked with the town on the preparation of an open space and recreation plan that was approved by the state in 2018. So next slide for the quick opening poll question. So in that plan, it was identified that there's about 356 acres of permanently protected open space in the town. Out of that 356 acres, what's your guess as to how many acres are for recreational purposes, as well as the number of park and ball fields? Okay, the majority of people who responded are correct. It's 79 acres of land representing 7 different parks and ball fields. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the town completed their open space and recreation plan. It's good through the year 2025. And we identified, the main resources that the town has for open space and recreation. We looked at a variety of things that were happening within the community improvements to various facilities such as the Memorial Stadium. We were talking in the plan about the Hanover Branch Rail Trail. And we also in the plan identified other open space related resources such as historic and cultural facilities, which will be discussed in more detail later on. And as has been mentioned earlier, we just wanted to point out that the population of the town is relatively steady, but we did look at how the population was breaking down. And like a lot of other communities, Rockland is seeing a larger percentage of people who are uh, 65 and older. Um, so we need to keep that in mind when we look at open space and recreational resources. Next slide, please. So this map on the slide is shows a summary of the action plan map and the inventory map for from the open space plan. And we identified a number of open space areas that are listed to the left where there are opportunities for improvements, better connections between various resources. And then we'd be at each of these facilities looking at things like picnic areas, how to improve the shoreline, for instance, at Reed's Studley's Pond, improvements to running tracks and walking paths, as well as opportunities for more ball fields or courts like basketball courts. And as is frequently the case when we do an open space plan, question of whether or not there should be a dog park somewhere. So the open space plan summarizes a lot of this, and for the master plan, we're going to be building on the recommendations and confirming some of the recommendations that were in the open space plan. Next slide, please. Connections between and creating networks between different open spaces is a very important part of an open space and recreation plan and a master plan. Trying to find ways to improve connections between various areas, either by bike or by foot, are particularly important. So we wanted to look at some of the main resources, Rockland Town Forest being a particularly important one, looking at the opportunities at Union Point to identify ways in which the trails can be connected and that people know how to get from point A to point B through proper signage. We also recognize that the Hanover Branch Rail Trail provides another unique opportunity to do that and to try and make connections with abutting communities such as Hanover and Abington. Next slide, please. So I mentioned Memorial Stadium, but we also wanted to think about open space and recreation, not only in terms of parks, but in terms of looking for opportunities in perhaps some of the downtown areas and trying to find ways in which smaller, unique spaces can be utilized to provide a respite from your typical paved over downtown or other commercial areas, and look for ways in which people can find places to rest and recreate in smaller locations. Next slide, please. So here are some examples that we'll be talking about a little bit later on, and will be discussed in the poll questions that will come up in a few minutes. But parklets are small parks that are just sort of created within existing sidewalk or parking spaces, just to create places for people to sit down, maybe outside a coffee shop or something along those lines. Pocket parks are looking for small areas where you might be able to create a park that is otherwise not being utilized for any particular purpose. And it can be done in an alleyway, it can be done in front of a building, it can be done adjacent to a building. So these are some examples that could be considered. Next slide, please. So we'll go through the poll questions. Again, we have 3 poll questions. And the first one asks about the downtown area along Union Street. What types of open spaces would you like to see along that area? The second question asks, where would you like to see the town create more extensive trail networks? And the third question talks a little bit more specifically about Hartsuff Park, which is a main resource within the town. It offers a lot of different opportunities, and asks, what do you think is the most important improvement that could be made to that park? So we'll give it a few minutes to for everyone to have a chance to vote. Okay, so for the first question, it seemed like everything got a vote, but people seem to like the idea of plazas with seating areas in front of buildings as the most popular option. In terms of where the town should create more extensive trail networks, again, everything got at least some votes, but the top 2 would be, uh, utilizing the spaces in and around Union Point, and adding connections to the Hanover Branch Rail Trail. And for Hartsuff Park, the key question, the answer that got the most responses there was, again, to add more walking trails. So there's clearly some interest in doing that. And I would also just add before I finish that a lot of these responses are pretty consistent with some of the discussions that we had at our public forums when we were working on the open space plan a couple of years ago. So thank you, and we'll turn it over to, I think Courtney goes next.
Hi, good evening. My name is Courtney, and I'll be discussing historic and cultural resources. This element of the master plan presents opportunities to strengthen preservation efforts and enhance cultural resources in Rockland. I'm hoping that collectively we can start to discuss some of the initial ideas during our breakout session. How do we celebrate the town's historic assets? What types of programming are residents and visitors wanting to see in Rockland? What are some ways the town can forge new and better partnerships amongst private, nonprofit, and public sectors? And what is the legacy the town wants to leave for future generations? Next slide. So before we jump into things, we're going to do a quick poll. And the question asks, how many of you can guess the number of historic properties on the Register of Historic Places and the state's historic inventory? All right. So the polls are in, and um, it looks like most most people got the answer right. It is 7 properties on the National Register and 308 listings on the Commonwealth inventory. Next slide. Maintaining and improving Rockland's historic and cultural character means that the built environment will reflect high standards of quality in its roadways, public spaces, buildings, and the landscape. Some key challenges are maintenance and preservation of historic structures, the reuse or repurposing of those structures, limitations in local and state funding for arts and culture, and communicating the value of arts, culture, and local history in economic terms. Next slide. So zooming in a bit, you can see that Rockland has a number of historic and cultural assets clustered around the Union Street corridor. Historic buildings, parks, natural features, art installations, uniquely defined streets and districts all contribute to community character. Identifying opportunities to leverage public assets such as libraries, recreation centers, parks in conjunction with the town's Reimagine Rockland initiatives can aid planning efforts in areas around these assets. Next slide. There are over 64 locally designated landmarks, National Register buildings, and districts located in Rockland, and a majority of them are located in and around downtown and in older neighborhoods. Rockland's Lower Union Street Historic District, which runs from Water Street to Market Street, contains 57 structures. While having a property listed on the National Register does recognize its historic and cultural significance, it does not necessarily protect it from demolition or redevelopment. It also does not restrict use. And I just want to note here that the town of Rockland is has community preservation, is a CPA community, a Community Preservation Act community, which qualifies it for funding for the preservation of historic and cultural structures. Next slide. In addition to properties located in the historic district, the town has 7 individually listed properties on the National Register. Next slide. Special events, self-guided tours, and aesthetic lighting enhancements are just a few examples of ways to celebrate and promote community assets. Next slide. It is important to encourage alternatives to demolition of significant resources, such as rehabs, adaptive reuse, and relocation when possible. This image is an example from a previous planning study which shows the adaptive reuse of the McKinley School building for mixed income housing. Next slide. Utilizing creative placemaking strategies such as gateways, public art, landscape features, interpretive and wayfinding signage can highlight and help celebrate the town's unique attributes, its history, and its culture. These strategies build on goals and recommendations outlined in the Soul of Rockland Creative Placemaking Project, which took place in 2018. Next slide. This is just another example of placemaking techniques that can support branding and identity while improving pedestrian safety. Next slide. Feedback from the online survey indicated that residents want to see more events and programming in town. The people who live in a community, the activities that take place in a community, and the physical environment all shape its identity. Special events like Rockland Day and the Rockland Farmers Market can provide unique opportunities for neighbors to interact and build relationships. And arts and culture help increase a sense of community and can also bring substantial economic benefits. Next slide. So now we're going to do a series of 3 polling questions. All right. The first question said, asks you to prioritize, ask what the town should prioritize in its historic and cultural planning. The second question asks what types of cultural facilities and venues are most needed in the town. And the third question asks what types of cultural events and programming are most important to you. I see your comment in the chat, Steve, and I do apologize for the way that this question is formatted. It was originally planned to be for as part as a survey question. So I do acknowledge that the question does ask you to choose up to 3. So I apologize for the way that it's structured on screen. But it looks like the results are in, and it looks like the highest priority is increased funding for arts and culture, events and programming. For question 2, it looks like creating a town common and plazas or a square is what's most needed. And then for the last question, creating a series of special events is important as well. All right, and with that, I'm gonna hand things off to Nicole Sanchez.
Thanks, Courtney. So I'm gonna be guiding us through the clean energy and sustainability section. So for this section, we're thinking through how we can help save on energy bills and promote sustainability. Some other measures we'd like feedback on are encouraging green building features and green public buildings. And then mitigation strategies, which are strategies that help us reduce carbon or energy use, and also adaptation strategies, which are measures that help us adapt to change or better meet some challenges such as flooding or heat and other climate strategies. So you can go on to the next slide. So we're going to start with this little poll to see if we can guess which of these sectors has the most energy use for municipal use. So we have street and traffic lights, buildings, vehicles, and water and sewer. Okay, and we have the results, and it looks like it was pretty close between buildings and water and sewer for your guesses. And actually, for municipal energy use, we saw that buildings made up 75% of all municipal energy use for the most recent year. We can go on to the next slide, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So here's some examples of measures and different strategies that can fall under this section and that we'd love to hear feedback on. For ideas for public buildings, these include eco roofs. So that can be anything from solar PV to having green roofs made up of green infrastructure. It can look like weatherization of buildings, so making buildings more resilient, energy efficiency measures for buildings, green infrastructure, EV charging stations. And then in this section, we can also encourage future developments to be to use clean energy and to be more sustainable. And so some of the measures and strategies that can fall under that can be through zoning and permitting and changing some of those processes. It can look like encouraging pervious surfaces and encouraging more green space. And we can go to the nice. So some of the plans that are related to this section and some of the measures that Rockland has already taken are that Rockland was designated as a green community in 2013. And along with that designation comes a goal to reduce municipal energy use by 20%. And there's an energy reduction plan to do so. Rockland also has a community choice aggregation program, which is a great way for residents and small businesses to adopt more clean energy. And then Rockland also has a hazard mitigation plan, and the development of that was through a community resilience building workshop, and that's under the Municipal Vulnerability Program. And some takeaways and findings that we've heard through those plans and some feedback so far is that buildings make up the majority of municipal energy use. We see that residential and commercial and industrial uses are about the same amount of energy when we're looking townwide. We're hearing about increasing frequency and intensity of storms, and then hearing concerns over power outages, flooding, and water supply. And then as a strength, we've really heard about the diversity of Rockland and some concern to make sure that there's support for low-income residents, residents with disabilities, and residents for whom English is not their first language. So this map shows the traditional way that we would look at climate vulnerability for a community. So here we're looking at, we're mapping flood zones and also looking at impervious surfaces. But on the next slide, I'll show a different way that we can think about climate vulnerability as well, that's more people focused. So here we're looking at the 3 census tracts for Rockland, and this is 2 images that come from our climate vulnerability in Greater Boston study that's also on our website. And so here we're looking at a representative chart for heat and for flood. And so this study looks at and maps different vulnerable populations, as well as the sensitivity to heat and flooding and a community's ability to adapt. So the sensitivity is this shield, exposure is the house and the thermometer, and the ability to adapt is the person walking and balancing on a ball. So we can see that the sensitivity for heat and flood is the piece that sticks out the most from this image. So here we're looking at the townwide energy use. So this includes residents and businesses. And here for the year 2018, we can see in green, a residential electric and gas use, and in yellow, commercial and industrial electric and gas use. And here we can see that for each month, the energy use for residential uses and the energy use for commercial and industrial are about the same. And then if we're looking at just municipal energy use, here's where we can see that answer to the poll we took at the beginning. So overwhelmingly, that energy use is coming from municipal buildings. So that gives us some clues for where we can focus our efforts to be really efficient. But it's worth noting that there are significant energy uses coming from water and sewer and from municipal vehicles as well. So on the next slide, we can dive a little deeper into the buildings. And so here we see a comparison for the last fiscal year for all of the municipal buildings and what their energy use looked like. So a big takeaway from this graph is that the Rockland High School and Middle School by far is using the most energy out of those buildings. Another takeaway is that a lot of the top users in terms of buildings are schools. So that can be an area to focus on as well. And then in the final slide, we can see a little bit of a deeper dive into the high school and middle school. And so here we're looking at the energy use for this building over the course of Rockland's time as a green community. And in the darker blue, we see the electric, and the lighter blue, the gas. And this is mapped with heating degree days and cooling degree days. So here we're looking to see if the gas use is more or less following the same pattern as the heating degree days. And if it's different from that pattern, then we're seeing that measures that have already been used in this building are actually reducing the energy use there. So now we'll share with you some 3 poll questions for this section for clean energy and sustainability to get some of your feedback on this section. So the first question is, where should the town focus its efforts on clean energy and sustainability? And remember, you can scroll down for the other 2. So the second one is, what can the town do to continue to help residents save on energy bills? And the third one is, which clean energy measure is your top priority? We'll give a minute for folks to answer those. Okay, so the results are in. So we see that for the first question, for where should the town focus its efforts on clean energy and sustainability, 50% of folks said that equal focus on both municipal projects and programming for residents and businesses. And we saw a little bit on either end of that scale. For the second question, the majority of folks came in for what can the town do to help residents save on energy bills. Most folks selected encourage green building features for future commercial and multifamily developments. And then we also saw a significant selection for continue to support and participate in the Clean Energy Choice program. And then for the third question, for which is your top priority, saw about half of people selected retrofit existing buildings to be energy efficient. And we also saw some interest in increased vegetation and increase the use of renewable energy.
Great, everybody. So this is Christian Brandt. I am a community engagement coordinator at MAPC. And originally we were planning to split up into some breakout groups for Q&A, but I think what we're gonna do is stick all together in this room so we can all have a conversation with each other. So in a second, I'm about to stop sharing my screen. So you won't see the presentation anymore. And then I will facilitate a Q&A, and some MAPC folks can feel free to answer. And then we also have some folks from the town and the committee who can weigh in as well. So I will stop sharing my screen. All right. So what I will ask everyone is that if you have a question, if you wouldn't mind posting that in the chat, if you can. And then I'll call on you to ask that question. I'll unmute you and I'll let you know that you're unmuted and you can ask the question, and then the MAPC staff and Town of Rockland folks can answer if they, whoever would like to best. So if you don't know where the chat is, you can look at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There should be a bar that has some buttons on it. And in the middle of that bar, there's a little talk bubble that says chat. So if you click on that, you'll open up a box on the right side. Alternatively, if you do have a question, you can also just physically raise your hand since I can see all of you. And I will unmute you and you can ask your question and then we'll move on from there. Great, so Kathy, it looks like you have a question. So I'm going to unmute you. And so you're unmuted, so go ahead, ask your question, and then when you're done, I'll put you back on mute and we'll answer.
Hi, I submitted my questions earlier along with photographs that I have taken of the rail trail and the horrible flooding issues that we have in certain areas, and also the incursions of vegetative matter through the tarmac, and also the trash situation on the trail.
Great, thank you.
Did you get
I didn't, but I'm glad that you posted them here. I think I'm probably not the person who would receive them. I'm just the community engagement person, but I'm glad that
You
you've
think
asked your question here. So
no one's aware?
I'm gonna direct that to whoever would like to answer that, Carlos or Jen Constable.
So,
Go ahead, Jen.
Hi, Christian. Hi, Kathy. We did not receive that information, but I'm happy if you, I'll put my email address in the chat function. And I think we could talk offline about any concerns and we'd be happy to address them with you.
Great, thank you. Anyone else who has a question for the Q&A? All right, I don't see anyone with a question in the chat. If you aren't able to figure out the chat, just raise your hand and let me know if you have a question and we can go from there. All right.
Was there just a topic covered in tonight's presentation, in tonight's workshop, that was of particular interest to anyone that, or do you feel very strongly or passionately about one of the topics that was presented tonight? Anything you want us to know, to consider in our analysis and thoughts about the project?
Hi, this is Doug Lapp, the town administrator. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good, thank you. So one thing I just thought I'd mention, some of you may know this, but for those in the community that aren't aware, I was just thinking about one of the particular items we were talking about with historic preservation. And one of the buildings that was included in the presentation was the McKinley School, which is a beautiful historic structure in town. We're actually in the final phases right now of having a full feasibility study that's being conducted by an architect. It was funded at last year's town meeting. And from my perspective as the town administrator, there's a tremendous number of wonderful opportunities that we could have with this building. But the problem, of course, is going to be funding, because it's going to be a very, very expensive project, and public construction is even more expensive than private construction because of the public construction laws. So I just thought I'd, throw that point out there, that as from my perspective, not as a resident, but as a, as a municipal official, I see both, tremendous opportunities with some of these things, but also big constraints, particularly funding, especially now that our economy is essentially collapsed and our town budget's collapsed as well. So I just thought I'd throw that out there for discussion if that was helpful.
It also looks like Steve has his hand.
Yes.
Right.
Steve, I'm going to unmute you really quickly so you can go ahead and ask your question. All right, you should be good to go.
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. So joined today, really invested in open space and parks. I think we're doing a good job with the building of the new centralized elementary school, and dedicating the parkland swap for that, and then dedicating additional parkland at Jefferson. Really interested in the expansion of the Hearts of Park area. I think there's a real opportunity for the town of Rockland to connect that with the John Smith conservation land, as well as the town land off of VFW Drive. One of the sections, I'm going to switch over to housing now. One of the sections that was presented in the survey sent out earlier this year, as well as presented earlier on in the slide deck, was about housing areas. And would have been interested to see what the survey results were related to where should we invest in housing. Personally, I think the area behind Home Depot is a great opportunity. It's close to the highway, and just really wanted to advocate for those issues.
Thank you, Steve. right.
I think for part 2 of the survey, there's a Qualtrics survey in which there might be an opportunity to give that level of detail as well.
Great. Carlos, is there anything else you wanted to add in response to Steve's question before we move on?
About housing and housing. So the initial survey didn't pull that precisely where, and we didn't get a lot of that type of, we were asking more about basically asking for what was the original locations from the housing production plan, but we didn't get a lot of more feedback on that. But there is an opportunity for people to give that level of detail in addition to the housing types that could inform zoning regulatory changes as well.
Wonderful, thank you.
I'll just add something regarding the open space plan. You know, as I mentioned when I was speaking earlier, Hearts of Park was clearly the topic of a lot of discussion when we were doing the open space and recreation plan. It's clearly a very important resource to the town. It's a multi-use facility that has seen some improvements over the years, particularly that new playground. But clearly there are a lot of other opportunities for expanding the trail network and looking for ways to improve the physical facilities at the site as well. So, you know, I think that what we'll be doing in the master plan is probably building on what was done during the open space plan and validating some of the recommendations that came out of that process. And just overall, it's important to note that the town of Rockland, while it hasn't done a master plan in a while, has undertaken numerous planning efforts over the recent years. And the presentation highlighted a bunch of those. And as Courtney mentioned during his presentation, the town does have some resources through the Community Preservation Act. Obviously, we recognize that recent events have skewed things a little bit in terms of financing and whatnot. And we need to obviously take that into account. But we'll also be looking, this plan will be looking 10, 15 years in the future. And presumably there'll be some sense of normalcy, hopefully sooner rather than later. And, you know, the master plan is going to tie all of this stuff together in an effort to try and figure out ways to move forward, you know, once those resources become more available.
If I could make one comment in addition to that, just so the public knows as well, we actually do have an opportunity to buy. I was just looking it up. I think it's roughly a 7.5 acre parcel of open space that directly abuts Hearts of Park to expand the Hearts of Park park area, and that's using Community Preservation Act funds. So that is something that was slated for the town meeting that we had to postpone, that was supposed to be a couple weeks ago, and will be on the warrant for the town meeting that we're planning for June 22nd.
Wonderful, thank you all so much. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments, feedback that they want to provide while we're here about the presentation or about the master planning process if you've been involved in more than just this? So it looks like Lenny asked, what's the best way for residents to get involved in the master plan? I can answer from the community engagement perspective. You can contact myself or Carlos, and I'll put our emails into the chat. But you can also visit our master plan website. I'll also place that link in the chat, but then I'll direct this to Carlos.
So one of the ways is what you're doing right now. But another way you can help us too is sharing the link that we have posted at the beginning and at the end of this presentation. That there's a second part to this online open house in case anyone was unable to participate tonight, in which they can basically go through a lot of the same content. There's actually a little bit more additional content on the part 2 online open house webpage. And there's a Qualtrics open house survey there as well. So throughout the entirety of the month of June, you can go at your own pace and be able to go through a lot of the similar questions that we went through, as well as others, and just give us as much feedback as you can about these ideas. Also, on the MAPC Rockland page, there's content from the first two community workshops on different topics. So that's another way that you, if you could just share the link and encourage people to give us as much feedback as possible, that'll help us as we try to draft a vision statement for the document, piecing together a lot of the ideas that we've gotten from this workshop, from the survey, from the prior two public workshops, help us create the goals and strategies, and ultimately recommendations and an implementation table in which we take an attempt at going down the list of all the various ideas and recommendations that you have for different topics, and trying to figure out a way that makes sense for suggesting an action plan for you and saying, these are based on input and community priorities. These are the action items that we think you should proceed with in the near term, the midterm, and the longer range of the 10-year horizon for the master plan. Did that help, Lenny? Is it?
And Carlos, isn't there going to be theoretically one more
Correct.
public forum toward the end of the process? Hopefully
Yes.
we can do it live and in person by then.
So correct, I forgot about that one. So at that stage, we'll actually be able to see at an undetermined time in the future a draft master plan document, and you should be able to recognize a lot of these ideas from the survey, from tonight, from the part 2 of the open house, which will be active all June, as well as the past workshops. And so basically for that final forum, we'll try to make a plan document digestible and easy to basically like the high level highlights of it, in order to give you a sense of an opportunity to wordsmith and change and help us see if we got it right. And if so, help us also to rank the priority of all the different ideas and recommendations, so that we can put it into the implementation action plan table in the right sequence.
It looks like, Kathy, it looks like you have a question. I'm about to unmute you.
Thank you. I have two. One is the email that I got said this event was going to be May 21st, 2020 at 5 p.m. And the other thing I wanted to do was confirm, because I sent photographs and emails to RESZOOMLINE @mapc.org. I assume that they were received. They were also sent to Doug Lapp and to Donald Kian.
Great.
And I don't understand why there doesn't seem to be any receipt of this information.
Kathy, I can answer the part of that email question. The email that you mentioned, which is Res Zoom line 4, is actually just the account that MAPC has set up to host this Zoom line. And so the email that you sent to that just goes to the Zoom account. But it sounds like you also were able to email other people. So I will let perhaps Doug or Don address that question if they'd like.
Sure, I'll be happy to look through my emails and forward them along to you guys. No problem. I get a lot of emails, so I don't always respond to everything same day. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kathy.
Well, I just want to say that it said RESZOOM. So did you get no questions from anyone else?
So as I was explaining, the Zoom line is just the email account that we use to schedule Zoom appointments. So it's not a public outreach line, but in the email invitation that we sent, there was a opportunity to contact Carlos, the MAPC staff person who's hosting this at the bottom. So I
No,
apologize
it
for that
says,
confusion.
I'm reading to you. I will show it to you. Can you see this? It says, please submit any questions to RESZOOM. I mean, that's exactly what I did. I followed instructions.
Yeah,
What's
I
wrong
apologize
with
for that
What am I
confusion.
doing wrong?
Yeah, I apologize for that confusion. It's just sort of one of the ways that we've set up our Zoom account.
Okay,
All right.
I guess we're done here.
I am going to move on to some other folks if you have any other questions. And Kathy, I'm going to put you back on mute, but if you have something else, just raise your hand. Carlos, I might want to direct, oh, Jen, you raised your hand. Thank you, sorry. Oh, okay, great.
May I pose a quick question to the participants?
Absolutely.
I know that this question may have been asked before, and it was also shown in some of the survey results, but I would really love to hear from a few people on the line, like, what is it that you love about Rockland? Is there a particular place or event that takes place within the town that really gives you a sense of belonging, a sense of place? Because those are the type of things that are sometimes hard to capture. If anyone has any comments, or it would be great to hear.
I think Kathy has another question.
Yes, Kathy, I'm going to unmute you very quickly. And then we can, I think Dawn also has a question, so I will unmute Dawn when you are done.
Okay, very quickly, what people are using right now is the rail trail. It needs maintenance, it needs trash pickup, which I have personally been doing like every day that it isn't raining by myself. And it needs to have hydraulic remediation. I'm done.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Dawn, I am going to unmute you very quickly, and then you ask your question. Thank you so much.
This is more of a comment. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My question is a comment. We mentioned in the open space idea, the connecting to other towns, and of course the rail trail connects to Abington and Hanover. Hanover also has trails that connect to us as well. And the trails on the base, they connect to Abington again and Weymouth, and this may even in the future be a possibility to connect to Hingham on that. Also looking at some pieces of land that may connect to such as the town landfill may connect over to Hanson, and we also have a connection currently that connects trails in Rockland to Whitman, and if we acquire some more land, we may increase connections to Whitman and Hanson. So those are things with trying to proceed, but some of these things are easier than others, as you can appreciate.
Thank you so much, Don. I also just want to note that it looks like Christine wrote in the chat, I moved to Rockland in 2008, and what I like is that I feel safe when I walk alone. It's a great community. I enjoy the Christmas stroll and Rockland Day. Thank you so much for including that in the chat. All right, I will turn it over to Carlos for some closing remarks.
So I just wanted to follow up on Don's comments about all of those various rail trail connections. Of those, are there any that you would consider priority, or because there are various connections?
Well, there's some questions about the open space and what's going to be done with the base, because it's in a bit of a turmoil, as you can understand. So we would like to increase that. The base has been working as the master developers working with Wildlands Trust to do those things. everything seems to be on hold a bit. And of course, you know about the land that was supposed to be in a swap that was a mortgage was taken on it, and now it's in a bit of a limbo, and we're not sure what's going to happen there, and we're not sure what ammunition we have in the future. There's some agricultural land in town that if they give it up, we would like to certainly acquire that to increase connections to our neighboring towns and increase the idea of the emerald necklace around town.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. It's very helpful.
Before we move on, Carlos, I also see that Steve just raised his hand. So I think we have time for one more comment. So Steve, I'm going to unmute you. You should be ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. You know, it was an interesting question. You know, what makes Rockland special? You know, I'd like to echo that, you know, Rockland Day and the Christmas stroll are events that draw a lot of community engagement. You know, growing up in the town, Rockland has a strong sports history. You know, the stadium being a big draw for crowds, especially growing up. Football season is pretty big, and I think we're seeing a resurgence in baseball up there. And the expansion of the Spring Street fields, and you know, really interested to see what happens at Jefferson over the years as we continue to develop that place as open space. So just wanted to mention those things. Did want to echo, you know, the confirmation email that is sent out. You know, if you guys are considering doing additional Zoom meetings, you may want to check the registration email address, because anyone that gets the confirmation is going to see that email, and it does say please submit questions too. Just so you don't miss any opportunities for engagement.
I really appreciate you mentioning that, Steve. Thank you so much. And Kathy, I just want to let you know that your email has been forwarded to the MAPC staff, so we'll make sure to get in touch. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Carlos for some closing remarks.
All right. I just want to thank everyone for making time during this unusual time that we're in to do this. The team was we look very much forward to putting together this program, and we're encouraged that there's still a lot of interest in pursuing and talking about master planning studies in this time period. So what we want to do right now is we ask of you if you could please very much forward the link to for the part 2 of the open house to all of your friends and neighbors. It's available throughout the entirety of the month. It'll help us greatly to be able to start to get as much information so we could start teasing out patterns and trends and all of the feedback that we get in all of the different ways in which we seek input, so that we can actually start to write recommendations and strategies and goals with a level of certainty that this is what the community wants to see happen. And with that, we're going to conclude this event with a short aerial video tour that didn't work earlier, fingers crossed. And otherwise, please go to that part 2 open house or share the link with your friends and neighbors and family. Thank you, everyone. So we put this together just to frame when we think about master plan ideas. Maybe there are certain parts of town in which these ideas are highly suitable or make more sense. So that's the kind of feedback we would also want to encourage people to be thinking about, whether All right, thank you, everyone, for joining us. This concludes our workshop event.
Thank you, everybody, and make sure to check out the link I posted in the chat.
Good night. Thank you.